This video is brought to you by True Tales of Buried Treasure, the largest collection of old treasure magazines in the West. On our website, you can search for individual treasure stories by region, or buy our original magazines themselves. To pay us a visit, please click on the link in the description. Enjoy. Driver Joe Tuttle was making up for lost time as his stagecoach rolled southward along a smooth stretch of road flanked by rugged rocks. He approached the narrow headwaters of Raft River in southern Idaho Territory with little concern. Aboard the stage were an iron chest and 5 packages destined for the Wells Fargo office at the railroad in Kelton, Utah. It was June 1876, and stagecoach robberies were rare on this isolated part of the route, far removed from the mining towns and early farming settlements of the Snake River Valley. The thought of a holdup was the last thing on Tuttle's mind. But as Tuttle rounded a bend, a lone masked rider emerged from behind a towering rock, startling him. The stagecoach driver, though experienced in such dangers, could hardly believe his eyes. Yet his instincts kicked in, and he brought his 6-horse team to an abrupt stop. Tuttle suspected there might be more bandits hidden nearby, though he saw no sign of them. The lone shotgun guard, not wanting to risk a fight, dropped his weapon and raised his hands. The masked man, dressed in dark clothing and astride a bay horse, pointed his 6-gun and ordered the guard to toss down the iron box. The guard hesitated but complied, struggling to heave the heavy chest over the side of the coach. It hit the ground with a resounding thud. The passengers, 4 men, huddled on one side of the coach, anxiously watching the scene unfold. None dared reach for a weapon, fearing for their lives. The bandit, with a commanding voice, ordered, "Throw off the other shipments." "What others?" Tuttle stalled, but the outlaw wasn't fooled. "You know what I mean, throw them down," he barked. 2 small but dense bundles hidden among the baggage on top of the stage were handed over by the guard at Tuttle's direction. The bandit then demanded more from the rear boot, where 3 additional packages were stowed. It was evident he knew exactly what the stage was carrying, a secret shipment only Tuttle was supposed to know about. In under 10 minutes, the bandit had the valuables in hand and waved the stagecoach on its way. To the passengers' relief, they were left unmolested, their personal belongings too trivial to interest the thief. Tuttle wasted no time. Urging his team southward at full speed, he crossed the river east of the Narrows and stopped at Streville Station near the Utah border. His report, combined with the passengers' accounts, stirred immediate action. 4 freight outfits preparing to head north provided men for an 8-member posse, including 2 part-time county officers. Despite the late hour, the posse set out at once, camping north of the river that night. At dawn, the posse reached the robbery site. Tracks confirmed a lone bandit had carried out the heist. Evidence showed he had a pack mule hidden nearby, where the iron chest had been forced open and its contents removed. After carrying off 1 load, the bandit had returned under cover of darkness for the rest. It was then the posse realized the magnitude of the theft. The trail was easy to follow, leading directly west into the silent city of rocks, a bizarre and remote landscape of granite formations spanning 25 square miles. Turrets, monoliths, animal shapes, and hollow cones rose eerily from the ground, creating a maze of natural sculptures. The bandit had vanished into this fantastic wonderland, leaving the posse to wonder how they would ever find him in such a place. Many of the eroded formations in the silent city of rocks are named for their striking resemblances: Dragon's Head, Giant Toadstool, Old Hen, Old Woman, Elephant Rock, and more. Sharp spires and towering monoliths soar as high as 250 feet into the sky. The area's peculiar landscape is a maze of caves and crevices in massive mounds of decayed granite. Springs and water catch basins are scattered throughout, along with juniper and cedar trees. The cliffs bear the carved names of emigrants from the old trails, while smoke-blackened cave walls hint at ancient habitation by indigenous peoples long before Europeans arrived. For outlaws, the silent city was a natural refuge, its recesses easy to defend and conceal treasures. When the trail of the stagecoach bandit led into this eerie wilderness, the posse wasn't surprised. Many outlaws before had vanished into its labyrinth, and stories of buried loot were common. However, tracking the thief proved challenging. The horse and mule tracks split in multiple directions, creating a chaotic puzzle that grew fainter until disappearing altogether. By mid-afternoon, the posse found themselves disoriented in the stony maze. It wasn't until they emerged on the north side, near Goose Creek, that they regained their sense of direction. As they rode into open terrain, a lone rider appeared in the distance, leisurely jogging along with a black pack mule in tow. Surprised, the posse quickened their pace, thundering toward the man. Hearing the commotion, the rider glanced back, then calmly reined in his horse. A reaction so nonchalant that it left the posse puzzled. Surely no bandit would act this casually. The posse surrounded him but held their weapons. The rider was a tall, lean, clean-shaven man with feverish blue eyes and a hint of amusement in his expression. While his mule was searched, he appeared thoroughly unbothered, even entertained by the scene. The search turned up only camping supplies, food, a gold pan, and tools, nothing incriminating. His saddle carbine and holstered six-gun weren't unusual in Idaho, where most men were armed. The posse leader questioned him. "What's your name and business?" "Jim Looney," the man replied with a faint smile. "Heading to the Boise Basin goldfields, hoping to strike it rich." "Did you come out of those rocks?" the leader asked, nodding toward the silent city. Looney turned, studying the jagged skyline of stone spires, then shook his head. "Nope, came straight north into Idaho. You can backtrack my trail if you don't believe me. Say, are you fellas looking for someone?" "We are. You, for robbing the stage on the river yesterday." "What river? Last one I crossed was way down in Utah. I ain't no holdup man." At this, the posse drew their weapons. Looney was disarmed, his person and belongings searched. The only gold he carried was a small pouch of about 10 ounces of dust, clearly not the fortune stolen from the stage. Despite his protests, claiming he hadn't even been in Idaho during the robbery, the posse took him into custody and escorted him back to Strevel. With no jail or court at the station, Looney was sent under guard to Boise. There, he remained amused by the entire ordeal, even as he was locked away. The insurance company that underwrote the stage line's losses demanded he be held. The robbery had cost them $150,000, and Looney was their only suspect. They were desperate, clinging to him as their only lead. But Looney was gravely ill. A doctor diagnosed him with consumption, yet the authorities persisted. An insurance agent, disguised as a fellow prisoner, was placed in his cell to gather information. Over time, the agent uncovered that Looney had been in Idaho before, operating under aliases. In Silver City, he'd been known as Jones. In the Salmon River diggings, Hammond. And in Boise, he'd gone by yet another name. Confronted with these identities, Looney vehemently denied them, insisting he'd never set foot in Idaho prior to his arrest. As more aliases came to light, the insurance company grew confident they had their man. Meanwhile, posses scoured the silent city for the missing loot, but found nothing. Company agents tried a softer approach, offering Looney a deal. If he revealed the treasure's location, they'd ensure a lighter sentence. Looney, however, remained steadfast, his faint smile betraying nothing. Finally, Looney was offered $500 to reveal the location of the stolen loot, but even with such a tempting offer, he refused. "I have never robbed a man, much less a stagecoach," he insisted. His resolve was unshaken, even under relentless questioning. Joe Tuttle, the stagecoach driver and key witness, examined Looney but couldn't positively identify him as the bandit. Neither Looney's appearance nor his horse matched his memory of the roadside robber. Shortly after, Tuttle himself would leave Idaho and later meet a grim fate, hanged in Arizona. While languishing in jail, Looney fell ill. A cold quickly turned into pneumonia, and he was soon bedridden with a high fever. In his delirium, he let slip a few cryptic remarks to his cellmate, the undercover cattle thief. "I'll get well and they ain't got nothing on me," he bragged feverishly. "Right down there in them rocks, I'll dig me up a stake and head east. Live the rest of my days in fine style. Figured it was smart to leave it all there so's it'd get cold." Later, he mumbled, "I'll fight this bug that's got me down. Maybe go to Southern California. I hear the desert country kills these bugs." These ramblings were relayed to the insurance company agents, who urged further questioning. When the cellmate brought up the topic of the loot, Looney chuckled weakly. "I know, and nobody but me will ever see it again." Despite their suspicions, the truth was never confirmed. Before Looney could be persuaded to disclose the location of the treasure, his condition worsened, and he died. The insurance company promptly dispatched a search party to scour the silent city of rocks, but after a month of effort, they came up empty-handed. Others, hearing of the treasure, joined the hunt. 2-, 3-, and 4-man groups combed the area from the silent city to Goose Creek. Yet no trace of the loot was found. The treasure was rumored to include small gold ingots from Boise mines, packages filled with gold coins, and currency from a Boise bank. Wild stories emerged about where Looney might have hidden the haul. Some said it was buried in caves, others claimed it was sunk in a deep spring. There were even rumors it had been divided and scattered across the silent city. None of these tales could be proven. Eventually, interest in the treasure waned. The changing population, drawn to new gold strikes or other opportunities, left behind only exaggerated stories of Tuttle's stage robbery. In 1887, more than a decade after the incident, a seasoned prospector named Mark Hampton arrived in Boise. Quiet and unassuming, Hampton was known as a good listener. He had read about the robbery in old newspapers and seemed to know many details about Looney, if that was even his real name, and the events surrounding the crime. Though the construction of the Oregon Short Line Railroad had long since ended the stagecoach era, Hampton sought out people who had been involved in the robbery. He tracked down former employees of the stage company and even the sheriff of Ada County, asking probing questions. One query in particular raised eyebrows. Did Looney send any letters while in jail? The ex-sheriff thought for a moment. Seems to me he did," he replied. "Can't recall to who, though. It's been over 10 years. I think one went to somebody in Montana." What became of Hampton and his investigation remains unknown, but the treasure of the Silent City was never found. It lives on as one of the many enduring mysteries of the Wild West. The known letters, or any that Looney may have written, would have been examined for clues about the hidden loot. Hampton posed an intriguing question. Could he have slipped one out secretly? In their discussion, it became clear that while Looney had been closely guarded and secured in his cell, he might have found ways to communicate covertly. Although escape was impossible, his movements within those constraints were not overly restricted. Hampton was a solitary and resourceful figure, known for his ability to travel swiftly and unnoticed. His deliberate, unhurried demeanor masked his efficiency. Often traveling by night, he left Boise quietly, taking with him a sturdy saddle horse and 2 well-loaded red Missouri pack mules. He followed the Snake River east, crossing its tributary Sailor Creek, then forded Salmon Falls Creek. Guiding himself by Squaw Peak, he crossed Goose Creek and entered the silent city of rocks. There, Hampton discovered a recent campsite and traced the tracks of 3 men into the northern section of the rock formations. To avoid unwanted attention, he deliberately steered clear of them and focused his efforts in the southeastern corner of the area, not far from the site of the 1876 robbery. Hampton established his camp in a secluded cove with access to water and grass. Over the next few days, he explored the old emigrant trails, examining the hundreds of inscriptions carved into the cliffs. One particular inscription near his camp caught his attention. Written on the back of a reference paper he carried was L.L. Day, H. P. Lovell, 1847. The weathered cliff inscription partially matched the document. After careful study of the eroded carvings, Hampton concluded it was the starting point he had been seeking. Standing south of the inscribed rock face, he identified natural landmarks to guide his search. The next morning, he began his hunt in earnest. The maze-like terrain of the silent city made direct navigation impossible. Frequently thrown off course, Hampton scaled high rocks to reassess his bearings. 2 weeks passed before he stumbled upon a small pocket with a sandy floor. On the northern side, a low, dark opening led into a cave. Crawling inside, Hampton found the cavern to be about 15 feet high and 20 feet long. Charcoal remnants and 2 rusted tin cans stirred his excitement. This evidence of past occupation suggested he was on the right track. Too late to excavate that evening, he returned to his camp. The next morning, equipped with a shovel, a sack, and tallow candles for light, Hampton began digging under the firebed in the cave. He uncovered nothing there but replaced the cans and charcoal as he refilled the hole. Moving to another spot, he started digging again. Less than a foot down, his shovel scraped something solid. Kneeling, he cleared the sand by hand and unearthed a 3-gallon copper water bucket. Bringing the bucket into the light, Hampton found it partially filled with sand and gold coins in $10 and $20 denominations. The coins, dated between 1870 and 1875, totaled about $2,000. Despite this discovery, Hampton doubted the coins were part of the stagecoach loot. A large copper bucket would have been cumbersome to carry in a saddle pannier, and such buckets were uncommon at the time, with galvanized and aluminum ones becoming the norm. Still, Hampton recognized that specific information had led him to the cave. He continued digging additional holes, but found nothing further. Aware of the 3 men he had avoided earlier in the Silent City, Hampton prudently ceased his efforts before sundown, leaving the mystery of Looney's loot unresolved. Carrying the bucket and tools a short distance from the cave, Hampton carefully erased his tracks in the sand by walking backward and smoothing them out. He repeated this meticulous process deep into the maze of natural rock formations, making it impossible for anyone to backtrack him. That evening, in the safety of his camp, he divided the gold coins into 3 packages, wrapping them in empty flour sacks. This cautious behavior was typical of Hampton, a man who always took precautions to protect himself. However, unknown to him, danger was already closing in. In the pre-dawn darkness, while Hampton rested, others moved silently through the shadows toward his camp. Oblivious to the threat, he rose early, cooked breakfast, and prepared for another day of digging. Just as he began gathering his tools, a rifle cracked from the rocks to the west. The bullet tore through his left shoulder, shattering his collarbone. Dropping to the ground in agony, Hampton scrambled behind a pile of boulders, clutching his 6-gun in his good hand, while shots continued to echo through the air. As the shooting ceased, 3 men appeared cautiously, their bearded faces grim and their weapons at the ready. 2 were burly and imposing, while the third was small and wiry. Hampton recognized them as the men whose tracks he had seen earlier in the Silent City. They advanced warily, scanning the area. "I got him for sure," one of the larger men said smugly. "Must have died over there in the rocks." "Well, let's see if he found the loot for us," another replied. "Saves us the trouble of digging it up ourselves." From his crouched position, Hampton fired, catching the boastful one with a clean shot, dropping him instantly. The remaining 2 returned fire, their rifles awkwardly held at their hips as they backed away. Hampton's quick shots missed them entirely, and his empty gun left him vulnerable. Retreating behind cover, he reloaded clumsily with one hand, his injured arm hanging limp. The exchange of fire slowed. The surviving men withdrew to the edge of the pocket, one shouting, "We got you this time, huh?" Hampton painfully shifted his position and resumed firing. A bullet struck the smaller man, sending him down screaming in pain. The last assailant continued to fire, and a ricochet from a rock sent a sharp fragment slicing into Hampton's left thigh, the searing pain nearly overwhelming him. The downed man's agonized screams filled the air as his uninjured partner grabbed him by the arms, dragging him to safety. Hampton's gun was empty again, and he could only watch them retreat. After reloading, he waited silently, expecting their return, but as the sun climbed higher, it became clear they weren't coming back. Fever and shock set in, his wounds throbbing with pain. Testing the area, Hampton placed his hat on a stick and raised it over the rock. When no shots followed, he cautiously stood and scanned the area. His situation was dire. He was gravely injured, and staying in the Silent City meant certain death. Determined to survive, Hampton fashioned a sling for his arm and began packing his animals with one hand, preparing to leave. Despite his independent nature, Hampton realized he needed help. With his gear secured, he rode out of the Silent City as the sun began to set. Crossing Raft River without incident, He camped in the timber near the Utah border that night. From there, his journey became a feverish blur. High fever gripped him, but he stayed in the saddle as long as his strength allowed, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Mounting his horse each time required the aid of nearby rocks, his body too weak to manage otherwise. Each passing day blurred into the next as Hampton pressed forward, his will to survive driving him through the agony. The desert proved relentless for Hampton, forcing him to ride only at night to avoid the sweltering heat. During one daytime dismount under the scorching sun, he collapsed, reopening the wound on his swollen shoulder. Blood began pouring out anew, and he used the last scraps of his undershirt and bandana in a desperate attempt to staunch the flow. Frantic, he searched his pockets and found a piece of paper. Chewing it into a wad, he stuffed it into the bullet hole, hoping it would help stem the bleeding. It might have been the next day when Hampton finally reached Kelton, a small railroad town. As he rode into the streets, disheveled and bloodied, people stopped to watch him. He halted in front of a weathered saloon, his exhausted gaze scanning the faces staring back at him. Dried blood streaked his face, and his filthy, unkempt beard marked him as a man barely holding on. For a moment, no one moved. Then, out of the gathering crowd, a young man burst forward. "Mark, what in the world?" the man exclaimed. Hampton's bloodshot eyes focused on the voice. It was Scott Adams, a friendly young clerk he had met nearly 2 years earlier while staying in town. As Hampton tried to dismount, his strength gave out, and he began to fall. Scott lunged forward, catching him just in time. Several others rushed to help, gently lowering him to the ground. 3 days later, Hampton awoke in bed, his body numb and his mind foggy. His shoulder was tightly bound in clean cotton bandages, and his face had been shaved. A kind-looking, gray-haired woman stood beside him. "Where?" he croaked. "Rest easy," the woman said in a soothing voice. "You're safe now, Mr. Hampton. Scotty brought you here. You can thank him for finding you in time. The railroad doctor worked for 2 hours to clean your wound and set the broken bones." "Thank you, ma'am," Hampton murmured weakly. The Adams family, a Mormon household with many children, had taken him in. Scott, the eldest son, explained that he had been lucky the doctor was visiting town that day. "We don't usually have one here, but he'll stop by again in a few days to check on you," Scott said. "My stuff?" Hampton asked faintly. "Your stock and equipment are in our barn," Scott replied with a grin. "And the gold? It's in the store safe until you're well enough to claim it." Hampton nodded in relief, but then asked about the piece of paper he had stuffed into his wound. "An old letter. It was important." Scott shook his head. "There was nothing but that paper plugging the bullet hole," he said. "Whatever it was, it's gone." "It doesn't matter," Hampton replied. "I remember every word." As he recovered, Hampton gradually shared his story with Scott and the Adams family. He revealed that the paper had been a letter smuggled out of jail by an outlaw connected to the infamous 1876 stagecoach robbery. The letter detailed the location of the hidden loot. "By the time you get this, I'll either be dead or back to retrieve the buried gold. Follow a direct line north from the names copied off an inscription to the low mouth of a cave in a small pocket. It's there. If I'm gone, find it. If I'm in jail, hire a lawyer to get me out. They've got nothing on me, but they might railroad me anyway." Hampton had copied the exact wording and date from the inscription on the emigrant trail. Though partially eroded, the names L.L. Day and H.P. Lovell were still visible along with the date. Hampton believed it marked the starting point for the search. Hampton also recounted how he had come across an old outlaw, recently released from the Montana penitentiary at Deer Lodge. The man, whom Hampton had known years earlier, was too crippled to retrieve the loot himself. "The stuff is there," the outlaw had told him. "Go get it. And if you're feeling generous, give me a cut for my last years." Curious, Hampton had asked if Looney was the bandit's real name. The old man shook his head. "No," he said. "His real name doesn't matter. Just know his family was prominent in Salt Lake City. Go grab the stuff he stashed." With this knowledge and the letter in mind, Hampton had ventured into the silent city of rocks, setting the stage for his perilous search and narrow escape. As winter set in, Hampton decided to stay with the Adams family while he continued to recover. Though he could move around, he preferred to wait until spring before embarking on any further adventures. During a conversation with the elder Adams, the topic of hidden loot came up. Adams shook his head skeptically. "Which one? I've heard of at least a dozen hoards of outlaw swag buried in the Silent City. Plenty of folks have gone hunting for them, and you might have stumbled onto any one of them." Despite the elder Adams' doubts, Hampton remained convinced that Looney had indeed cached the stagecoach loot in the cave. He resolved to return in the spring to search again. Scott Adams, enthusiastic about the prospect, was invited to join him. In late April, the two men set out for the Silent City. Hampton quickly relocated the inscription that had guided him before, then led the way back to his old campsite. Curious about what might have become of the bushwhackers' bodies, they prodded the sandy soil with shovels. On one side, they found a grave that had been packed firmly and covered with a thick layer of sand. Turning their attention to the small cave, Hampton and Scott began digging in earnest, this time using lanterns for better visibility. They excavated the back of the cave down to solid rock, then cleared the front half of the floor. After 3 weeks of relentless work, they had completely emptied the cave, but found nothing. "It's got to be around here somewhere close," Hampton said, puzzled. That was the lead. Following the same alignment from the south marker, they discovered another small cave. Though the entrance required crawling, the interior opened into a larger space. Their digging unearthed rusted beaver traps, old belt buckles, a spur, and a bowie knife along with the bones of a man. Despite these intriguing finds, no treasure appeared. Undeterred, they explored and excavated 3 additional caves, but their efforts yielded no further clues. By fall, they returned to Kelton empty-handed. The Adams family was preparing to move to Brigham City, Utah, where they had purchased a farm. Scott went with them, eventually marrying and establishing his own farm. For several years, he heard nothing from Hampton, who had headed north to prospect in Montana. One day, however, Hampton reappeared in Brigham City. He told Scott that he had located and sold a silver lode in Montana, a discovery that had brought him considerable wealth. He also revealed that he had revisited the Silent City of Rocks the previous year to explore more caves, but had still come up empty-handed. After that visit, Hampton vanished from Scott's life. The Silent City of Rocks, with its maze of natural formations and rugged terrain, remains a magnet for treasure hunters to this day. Easily accessible from Burley via Idaho State Highway 27 to Oakley, a good road curves south and east through the edge of the Sawtooth National Forest to Almo. From there, a dirt spur road leads to the heart of the Silent City, a route still used by modern-day seekers of fortune. While a partial account of the $150,000 stagecoach robbery occasionally appears in Idaho newspapers or historical guides, the story is largely unknown. Most treasure hunters are drawn to the Silent City by tales of other outlaw caches rumored to be hidden there. Though there are many, none are believed to be as valuable as the fortune Looney stole from Tuttle's stagecoach in June 1876. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to read the original article or purchase the magazine from which it was taken, please check out our website, truetalesofburiedtreasure.com.